There is a specific moment in every one of these stories where the situation stops being something a family can manage from the outside, where the distance between them and the thing they're dealing with, the distance they've been carefully maintaining, the careful architecture of we will observe this, we will document this, we will understand this from a safe remove, collapses, where the thing that has been on the other side of the wall is suddenly, irreversibly, on the same side as you. For the Hargroves, that moment was the crack in the twins' bedroom wall. 4 feet tall, edges pushed outward, plastered dust on the floor like a fine white snow. And from somewhere inside, not close, not distant, but somewhere in the impossible geography of the space between the walls, the sound of a 9-year-old girl crying. Elias heard it first. He'd been awake, which had become his default state by week 3. Lying in the dark at midnight with the particular alert stillness of a man whose body had given up on the idea of sleep but hadn't told his brain yet. When the cry reached him, it was faint, filtered through the floor, through the walls, through whatever medium sound traveled through in this house, but it was Chloe. He knew his daughter's cry the way every parent knows it, not just the sound of it but the specific emotional register. This wasn't a nightmare cry or a startled cry. This was frightened and small and far away. He was out of bed and in the twins' room in seconds. Sarah was right behind him. She'd heard it from the study, had been up already, was in the hallway before Elias reached the twins' door. Ben was asleep in his bed. Undisturbed, deeply asleep, with the particular heaviness of a child who has been sedated by something, not drugs, but the deep somatic unconsciousness of a body that has been under sustained stress and finally surrendered to it. Chloe's bed was empty, cold, and there was the crack in the north wall. Elias stood in front of it with a flashlight, ran the beam along its length, examined the edges, pressed his palm against the plaster on either side. The wall was warm, warmer than usual, or maybe that was his imagination, or maybe it wasn't. He pressed his ear to the surface the way Ben and Chloe had done in those first innocent days when it had seemed like a game. He heard her, faint, attenuated, traveling through God knows how many layers of material and distance. But Chloe, crying, and beneath her crying, woven through it, the layered ambient sound of the accumulator, all those decades of collected voice, that vast archive of human sound, churning in the dark. He pulled back from the wall and looked at Sarah and said, very calmly, "She's in the wall." They woke Leo and Maya. Leo came to full alertness immediately. He'd been sleeping lightly, always sleeping lightly now, one part of his brain perpetually standing watch. Maya took a moment longer, sat up blinking, and then registered her parents' faces and was on her feet without another word. They went to the twins' room together. Ben was still asleep. They left him. Elias had a utility knife from the workshop. He pressed the blade into the crack and ran it along the length, widening the gap, letting the plaster crumble away. Then he got his hands into the crack and pulled. The wall gave more easily than it should have. The plaster came away in large sections, exposing the wooden lath beneath, and then the lath came away too, and then there was the inner face of the cavity wall, the layer of membrane material, dark gray and slightly glistening in the flashlight beam, covering every inch of the exposed surface. Elias cut through the membrane. Behind it was the passage. He shone the flashlight in and they all looked. It was narrow, maybe 18 inches wide, which was wider than it had any right to be given the external dimensions of the wall. The floor of it was the same membrane material as the walls and ceiling, unbroken, continuous, curving slightly at the junctions between surfaces the way organic tissue curves. The air that came out of it was cold, significantly colder than the room, cold the way the inside of a cave is cold, a deep, still cold that had never been touched by sunlight or warmth or movement. And the smell of it, Elias described it in his voice memo as metallic and organic simultaneously, like old blood and old tape, like the inside of something that had been sealed for a very long time. The flashlight beam didn't reach the end. The passage went back further than the exterior wall of the house should have allowed. Significantly further, Elias estimated later that the beam reached at least 30 feet before the darkness absorbed it, which was physically impossible given that the exterior wall of the house was, at most, 14 inches thick. Sarah said very quietly, "The geometry is wrong." Leo said, "The geometry has been wrong since we got here." They could hear Chloe's crying from inside the passage, still faint, still distant, still moving, as if she were being carried further in as they stood there listening. Earl Prout came at 6 in the morning. Not called, they hadn't called him yet, hadn't thought to yet, were still in the acute phase of panic where the brain narrows to the immediate problem and everything peripheral drops away. He simply appeared at the front door in the gray pre-dawn Carhartt jacket feed store cap, knocking with his 3-fingered hand. Like he'd known. Maybe he had. Elias told me later that he wouldn't put it past the house to have reached out to Earl in its own way. Sent him something. A sound through the dark. Elias let him in. Earl walked directly to the twins' bedroom without being directed. Stood in the doorway and looked at the hole in the wall. Looked at the passage beyond it for a long moment. Looked at the membrane material peeled back around the edges. He said without turning around, "Which one?" Sarah said Chloe. Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long?" Sarah said since midnight, 6 hours. Earl made that sound again, the low, not quite a word sound, and turned around. His expression was not what Elias had expected. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't fear. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting for a specific thing to happen for a very long time and was now in the complex emotional territory of being right about something he desperately hoped to be wrong about. He looked at all of them, Elias, Sarah, Leo, Maya, and said, "Sit down." Earl Prout had been born 2 miles up the county road from the farmhouse. He'd grown up with it as a fixture of the landscape, the old Crane place, locals called it, and left it at that, the way rural communities leave things at the names that predate living memory. His parents had told him to stay away from it. He had stayed away from it until he was 32. In 1979, a family named the Holloways had moved into the house. A couple and their 7-year-old daughter named June. Earl had been friendly with the father, helped him fix a tractor that first fall, had dinner at their table a few times. He'd noticed the things about the house that you noticed if you were paying attention. The warmth of the walls. The way sound behaved strangely in certain rooms. He'd filed it under old house, odd construction, and left it there. June Holloway had gone into the wall in February of 1980. Earl had been there when they found the crack in her bedroom wall. Had been there when her father went in after her. Had stood in the hallway outside the room for 4 hours while June's mother sat on the floor and listened to her daughter crying from somewhere inside the house's bones. He'd been the one to go in after the father when the father didn't come back. He held up his right hand, the one with the missing fingers. "I got about 40 feet in," he said. "Far enough to find the father. He was standing still in the dark, not moving. I grabbed his arm and he turned around and looked at me, and Earl stopped for a moment, reorganizing something behind his eyes. He looked at me like he didn't know me, like he was looking at something in a language he couldn't read anymore, like whatever he was, it wasn't quite him. He'd grabbed the man and pulled him back toward the opening. Something in the passage had grabbed Earl's hand. Not grabbed, consumed was the word he used, slowly, precisely. He'd felt 2 of his fingers simply cease to exist, like a flame going out, and he'd gotten out of the passage and pulled the father out behind him and collapsed on the bedroom floor. June's father came back physically intact, but there was something different about him afterward. Earl said this carefully, picking each word, something that accumulated over the following months. Small things, the way he spoke, the way he responded to his name, the slight lag occasionally between stimulus and response. Like a signal traveling an extra distance before it arrived. His wife noticed it. Earl noticed it. The man himself seemed unaware of it. The Holloways moved out in the summer of 1980. June had been found 3 days after she disappeared, wandering in a field a mile from the house. She was physically unharmed. She didn't speak for 6 weeks afterward, and when she finally did, she never mentioned what had happened inside the wall. She was, by the time Earl told this story, a 55-year-old woman living in Phoenix who, as far as he knew, did not discuss her childhood. Earl looked at the hole in the wall and said, "What's in there? I've had 50 years to think about what it is. What Crane built? He thought he was building a machine for consciousness. What he actually built was a trap." He paused. "It uses sound to exist. It built itself from sound over 100 years. But sound isn't enough, it needs the source. It needs the people. It collects voices until it has everything it needs from a family, and then it takes the one that's been most available. Most open to it." He looked at the passage. "The one that's been talking to it the most." Chloe, who had been sitting in the hallway conducting conversations with the wall, who had said the thing in the walls is what trapped them. Sarah put her hand over her mouth. Earl said, "I need you to understand what the inside of that passage is before any of you go in there. Because if you go in there without understanding, you won't come back whole." He called it the echo. Not a storage space, not a passage, an entire dimension of the house, the same architecture, the same floor plan, but inverted. Negative. A space that existed in the resonant overlap between the sound the house had accumulated and the physical structure that contained it. Crane's journals, Earl said, he'd read them. Years ago, he didn't say how he'd gotten access to them, described it as the acoustic shadow of the real house. The space that sound occupies when it has nowhere left to go. In the echo, Earl said, the rules were different. Not all the rules gravity worked, surfaces held you, but sensory reality was unstable. You would see shapes that corresponded to the architecture of the house but weren't quite right. You would hear everything, the entire accumulated archive of the accumulator, a century of human voices swirling around you in the dark. And in that environment, among those sounds, were the entities. He described them carefully. Not demons, not ghosts, something more specific. Fragments, he called them, what remained of the people the house had taken all the way in. Not quite the people themselves, not the full consciousness, but the vocal residue. The echo of a person, shaped like a person, with the voice and the behavioral patterns of a person, but hollow, running on repetition, on loop. Like a recording that had been playing for so long it had worn grooves in its own playback. There were many of them. He didn't know how many. He'd seen 3 in his 40 feet of penetration. He suspected there were dozens. And among them, deeper in, at the center of the echo, where Crane's original consciousness had long since been consumed and replaced by something assembled from 100 years of accumulated human voice, was the entity itself. The thing that thought in their voices and spoke in their voices and had sent 3 knocks through the wall to tell them it was ready. Sarah asked him how to get Chloe back. Earl said, "You go in, you find her, you bring her back, you do not speak, you do not make a sound." He looked at each of them in turn. The entities in the echo are completely blind. They have no visual sense at all. They exist in a world of pure sound. They navigate by it, they locate by it, they take people by it. If you go in there making no sound, they cannot find you. They will move around you. They will pass within a foot of you, but they will not find you. Leo said, "Chloe is crying." Earl nodded heavily. "I know." "They can hear her." "Yes." "So she's all ready." "Not yet," Earl said. "It takes time. What it did with the Holloway girl took 3 days before she was settled. You have time, not much, but time." Elias said, "What about when we find her? If she's crying? If she makes a sound when she sees us?" Earl looked at him steadily. "That's the problem you'll face when you face it," he said. "I can't solve it for you from out here." They argued about who was going in. Elias said him, non-negotiable. Sarah said both of them. Leo said all 3 of them. Maya said nothing for a moment and then said, in a voice that was very steady for a 16-year-old, "Someone has to stay with Ben." Everyone looked at her. She said, "Ben is alone in that room. He hasn't woken up through any of this, and that's not normal, and someone needs to be with him." Elias looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Earl. Earl said, "The girl's right, and someone needs to be outside the passage. Someone needs to hold that opening." Maya said, I'll stay with Ben and I'll hold the opening." She looked at her father. "Go get her." Elias held his daughter's face in his hands for a moment. Then he nodded. Earl went through the rules again. No sound. Absolute silence. Communicate through touch, through gesture, through eye contact. The passage would be dark, bring lights, but shield the beams, keep them directed at the floor. Move slowly. Move together. If they became separated, they had to stop immediately and wait. The echo's geometry was unstable, and moving independently without a reference point led to disorientation that could rapidly become irreversible. And if they encountered the central entity, if what Elias had taken to calling the crane thing found them, engaged them directly, Earl said there was only one thing that worked. He'd read it in the journals. He'd also, he said quietly, learned it through experience he didn't elaborate on. The entity was assembled from sound. It existed in resonance, and like any resonance system, it had a frequency at which it became unstable. Crane had written about it in his second journal, a specific acoustic principle, a sustained resonance at the structural frequency of the wall material itself, would introduce destructive interference into the echo, would destabilize it, force a collapse of the resonant space back into the physical. Elias, who had spent 20 years with his hands and ears inside the acoustic structures of antique instruments, who understood resonance the way a surgeon understood anatomy, who had mapped the warm patches on these walls and measured the frequencies they produced, and spent 3 weeks in involuntary, intimate study of the accumulator's acoustic properties. He already knew the frequency. He said, "I can produce it, vocally. It'll take about 30 seconds of sustained tone." Earl said, "If you do that inside the echo, you'll destabilize the whole space. The passage collapses. You need to be out before it completes." Elias said, "Understood." Earl said, "I mean it. 30 seconds of tone, the space starts to fold. You have maybe a minute after you stop before it's gone, if you're still inside." "I understand," Elias said. Sarah touched his arm. Elias looked at the passage. They went in at 7:45 in the morning. Elias first, then Sarah, then Leo. Single file, moving in physical contact, Sarah's hand on Elias' shoulder, Leo's hand on Sarah's. Flashlights angled down. Ben still asleep in his bed behind them. Maya sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the opening, back straight, Earl standing in the doorway behind her. The passage closed around them. The cold was immediate and total, not the cold of winter, but the cold of absence, the cold of a space that had never been touched by warmth. The floor was firm under their feet despite its organic texture. The walls pressed close on either side, close enough that Elia's shoulders nearly touched both simultaneously. The sounds hit them like a physical force. The voices. Not directed at them, not yet just present, filling the space the way water fills a vessel. All of them speaking at once, overlapping, layering. Decades of human voice in every register, every emotional key, laughter and argument and whispered endearment and screaming, and the particular sound of children talking to themselves. Elias had to actively suppress the instinct to cover his ears, to protect himself from the volume of it, because any movement beyond the careful, controlled movement of walking would make a sound, and they could not make a sound. He kept moving. The passage opened after about 20 feet into something wider. Not a room, the echo didn't have rooms exactly, or rather it had the shapes of rooms without their definition, spaces that suggested walls and corners without committing to them. The floor was solid. The ceiling was somewhere above them, invisible, all around them. In the middle distance were the voices, and among the voices now the shapes. Fragments, Earl's word was right. They were human in outline, the approximate height and posture of people, the general arrangement of a body, but incomplete. Their edges were uncertain, the way a sound wave is uncertain at its periphery. They moved through the echo with a slow, purposeful drift, turning their heads in the particular way that blind things turn their heads towards sound, scanning, always scanning. Their mouths were open. They were all speaking, adding their voices to the accumulated volume around them, fragments of things they had once said, cycling through their loops. Elias stopped. 3 feet to his left, a fragment moved through the space. It was tall, male in outline, wearing the suggestion of clothes that might have been from the 1940s. It passed within arm's reach. Its open mouth produced, quietly, over and over, "I hear it, I hear it, I hear it, I hear it." It did not turn toward them. It passed. Elias exhaled through his nose, the slowest possible exhalation, and kept moving. They found Chloe 30 feet in, maybe 40. She was sitting on the floor of the echo with her knees pulled to her chest, facing away from them. Around her in a loose circle were 6 fragments, more defined than the ones they'd passed, more present, their edges sharper. They were all facing her, all with their mouths open, all producing sounds that, as Elias moved closer in absolute silence, he recognized as her voice. Fragments of Chloe's voice played back from their mouths, slowly cycling, learning. The circle of them was still engaged in the process that Chloe had been facilitating from the hallway for weeks, the call and response sessions, the teaching. They had brought the teacher inside to continue the lesson more efficiently. Chloe was still crying. Small, hitched, near-silent sobs she had, some survival instinct operating beneath her terror, reduced her crying to the smallest possible volume. She was 9 years old and alone in the dark, and she had understood without being told that being quiet was important. Sarah moved past Elias. He caught her arm, looked at her, held her gaze. Slow, he communicated with his eyes, slow and silent. Sarah nodded. She crossed the remaining distance to Chloe on her hands and knees, moving in absolute silence, and put her hand on her daughter's back. Chloe went rigid with shock, a full-body startle, and made a sound, a small, cut-off gasp of surprise. Every fragment in the circle turned its head. Elias put himself between them and his family in one motion, spreading his arms, as if physical presence could mean something to creatures that didn't see. The fragments held still for a moment, heads oriented toward the sound's origin, recalibrating. Their mouths had stopped cycling. They were listening. Sarah had her arms around Chloe, her hand cupped over the child's mouth. Chloe's eyes were wide and fixed on the fragments around them. Leo tapped Elias on the shoulder. Sign language or an improvisation of it, pointed toward the direction they'd come from. Move, now. Elias shook his head, pointed at the fragments, still oriented, still listening. They waited. 20 seconds, 30. The fragments' heads moved incrementally, scanning, the way a radar dish sweeps an arc, looking for the source of a sound that had stopped, looking for them. Then one of them turned away, then another, then the third, the certainty of their attention fading as the signal faded, returning to their slow ambient drift. Elias let out a breath he had been holding so long the edges of his vision had begun to darken. Sarah stood carefully, drawing Chloe up with her, keeping her daughter's face pressed into her shoulder, one hand still lightly over her mouth, not restraining, comforting. Chloe had her arms around her mother's neck, legs wrapped around her waist, eyes closed, shaking silently. They formed back into their line, Elias first, Sarah carrying Chloe, Leo last. And then the light changed. Not dramatically, not the sudden blaze of something appearing, more like the ambient quality of the echoes non-light shifted, became more present, more directed. The voices around them dropped, briefly, in volume, as if the space had taken a breath. And from somewhere deeper in, from the place where the echo had a center, where Crane's original architecture had its heart, came a voice. Not cycling, not fragmented, not the looping residue of a person long since consumed. A voice that had been built from 100 years of human sound, and had achieved something that none of the fragments around them had achieved. Intention. It spoke in Elias' voice, not a perfect copy, better than a copy. Elias' voice distilled, the platonic ideal of his voice, with every idiosyncrasy and cadence and tonal quality rendered with a precision that the real voice had never actually achieved. And it said, "You don't have to leave." Elias stopped walking. Sarah pressed into his back, Leo pressed into Sarah. They stopped. The voice continued, calm, reasonable, wearing Elia's voice like a coat. What you're afraid of isn't here. What you're afraid of is out there. This place is permanent. Everything that comes in here stays. Your voices are already here. The better parts of you are already here. What would you be leaving for? It was, Elias told me later, the most frightening thing he had ever experienced. Not because of what it said, but because of how well it knew him. The specific register of fear it was targeting, not the fear of the dark, not physical fear. The fear of impermanence, of things not lasting. He spent his professional life restoring things that were falling apart, preserving things that were being lost. The thing in the echo had read him completely. Had found the precise frequency of his anxiety, and was broadcasting directly into it. He stood still for a long moment. Then he reached back and found Sarah's hand. And he kept walking. The voice followed them, shifting, Elias' voice, then Sarah's, then Leo's, cycling through them the way the walls had cycled through them for weeks, but with a fluency now, a control that was qualitatively different from the clumsy mimicry of those early days. It knew exactly which voice to use for which argument. It spoke to Leo in Leo's voice about the years of feeling misunderstood, about finally having found a space that could hear him perfectly. It spoke to Sarah in Sarah's voice about the documentation that could be done here, the research, the complete archive of human sound that no one else had access to. It was surgical. It was precise. Leo stopped once, just for a second. His body simply halted. Sarah bumped into him and he started moving again immediately, but that single second told Elias everything. The thing had found something in Leo, some frequency, and had used it. He reached back past Sarah and put his hand on his son's arm and kept it there for the rest of the walk. The passage back was longer than the passage in. That was the echo's geometry shifting, its dimensions destabilizing as the entity engaged them actively. What had been 40 feet of passage was now longer, 60 feet, 80. Elias kept his flashlight on the floor and moved steadily and didn't let himself think about the length. He could see the opening ahead, the light from the twins' bedroom, Maya's silhouette sitting cross-legged, waiting. The entity's voice rose behind them, not threatening, not demanding, but with a quality that was almost plaintive, almost sad, that Elias said was somehow the worst version of it. His own voice saying, "You're taking the child but leaving the sound. Everything you've said in this house stays here. Part of you is already here. Part of you will always be here." Elias stopped at the edge of the opening. He turned around. Sarah and Chloe went through. Leo went through. Elias stood at the threshold, 1 foot in the echo and 1 foot in the twins' bedroom, and looked back into the dark. The fragments had gathered. Drawn by the voice, by the commotion, by the sound of the entity's engagement, dozens of them in the middle distance, their open mouths all turned toward him. And behind them, further back, something that was not a fragment. Something that occupied space in the way a storm occupies space. Not a shape, but a presence. An organization of the dark. A coherence in the chaos of voices. Looking at him with something that had no eyes. He took a breath. And he sang. Not a melody. Not anything that could be called music. A single sustained tone, produced in the chest, projected forward. The frequency he had calculated from 3 weeks of involuntary acoustic study of these walls. The resonant frequency of the membrane material that lined every surface of the accumulator, every inch of the dead air space of the entire house. The destructive interference note. The effect was immediate. The walls of the echo shuddered. The voices, all of them, the full century of accumulated sound, fluctuated, stuttered, the way a recording stutters when the medium beneath it is disturbed. The fragments around him recoiled from the sound, moving away from it, their own voice loops disrupted by the interference. The gathering in the deep dark contracted, pulled away. Elias held the tone. 10 seconds, 15. The shuddering intensified. Cracks in the membrane walls of the passage, fine hairline fractures spreading in a pattern that looked, in his flashlight beam, like a face, an open mouth. screaming, rendered in fracture lines. 20 seconds. Maya grabbed his arm from the bedroom side. Her fingers closed around his wrist hard. 25 seconds. The passage behind him was beginning to close. Not crumbling, closing, the walls drawing together, the echo collapsing back into itself, folding like a lung deflating. He stopped the tone. Stepped through. Maya pulled him the rest of the way, and they fell together onto the bedroom floor, and behind them the crack in the wall sealed itself. Not slowly but instantly, like an eye closing, the plaster reforming over the gap, smooth and unbroken, the edges fusing as if they had never been apart. The room was silent. The wall was still. The wall was cool to the touch for the first time since they had moved in. Chloe was on the floor with Sarah, arms around her mother's neck, face buried in her shoulder. She was shaking. Leo was sitting with his back against the wall, not the north wall, the opposite wall, head back, eyes closed, breathing. Ben was awake now, sitting up in his bed, looking at all of them with the calm, unreadable expression he'd been wearing for weeks. Elias sat on the floor of his children's bedroom and put his hands over his face. For a moment, just a moment, everyone was still and together and intact, and the wall behind them was just a wall. Earl Prout was in the doorway. He was looking at the reformed wall. His expression was not relief. It was the expression of a man doing a calculation, working through something. Elias looked up at him and said quietly, "It's over." Earl didn't answer immediately. He was still looking at the wall. Then he looked at Ben. Ben was sitting in his bed looking back at Earl with that still, unreadable expression. And Earl looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a man who had spent 50 years thinking about a house and what it did to people. The eyes of a man who knew what to look for. Then Earl looked at Elias, and the expression on his face was one Elias had not seen there before. It was not relief. Downstairs, the front door opened. They all heard it. The specific sound of that door, the slight resistance of the old hinges, the particular low groan it made, the settle of the latch. All of them recognized it. They'd heard it 100 times. Nobody had gone downstairs. Elias started to get up. Earl put a hand on his shoulder and held him down with a pressure that was surprising for a man his age. He shook his head. They sat in silence, listening. Footsteps on the hardwood floor of the front hallway. Slow, deliberate, confident, moving toward the foot of the stairs. And then Elias' voice, coming from the bottom of the stairs, rising toward them, easy and familiar, the way you call upstairs when you've just come home. "Hey, I'm back." Perfect. The voice was perfect. Not the slightly off quality of the early mimicry, not the uncanny valley of a copy that was almost right. This was Elias. This was his voice at his most relaxed, his most familiar, the voice that lived in this house and belonged to this family. Except Elias was sitting on the floor of the twins' bedroom with his hand still over his face. Sarah looked at him, he looked at the door. Leo looked at Maya. Maya looked at the wall. Downstairs, the voice came again, Elias' voice. From the foot of the stairs, patient and warm and completely wrong. "Guys, anybody up there?" Earl Prout reached into the pocket of his Carhartt jacket, and his hand closed around something. He looked at the bedroom door, then at Elias. And he said, very quietly, in the tone of a man delivering information that cannot be made better by how it's delivered. "What you just did in the echo, the tone, the collapse, it didn't just close the passage." He paused. "It opened the door." Downstairs, a floorboard creaked. Footsteps on the bottom stair. Something wearing Elias Hargrove's voice beginning to climb.